My name is Rachel Elaine Morrow. I'm 37 years old, and the sentence that changed everything was 6 words long, delivered without hesitation by the man who raised me, in a room full of people who had known me my entire life and said nothing. You were never really family. He said it the way you say something you have been holding for a long time and have finally decided costs less to say than to keep. I stood up. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I pushed my chair back from the table in the conference room of a law office on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and I picked up my bag, and I began to walk toward the door. Because there are sentences that end conversations, and that was one of them. I had taken 3 steps when the attorney said, "Everyone sit down." Not loudly, but in the tone of a man who has been waiting for this exact moment and is not going to let it pass without being heard. I stopped. I turned. Arthur Vance was 62 years old and had been my grandfather's attorney for 19 years. He had a face that did not perform emotions it did not mean, and a voice that did not rise when it wanted to be taken seriously. He was holding a manila file folder on the table in front of him with both hands, the way you hold something you have been keeping safe for a long time and are finally ready to open. He said, again, "Everyone, sit down." I looked at my father. He was looking at the file. His expression was the one I had seen exactly once before in my life, at my grandfather's funeral, when the pastor had said something about legacy, and my father's face had done something complicated that I had not understood then, and was beginning to understand now. I sat down. I've told pieces of this to 3 people. My husband, who held my hand through most of what came after. My best friend, who drove 4 hours to sit with me the week the results came back. And a therapist I still see on Thursdays, because some things need a room with professional walls before you can say them without coming apart. I'm telling it here because I have been carrying it for 2 years, and it is ready to be carried differently. If you want to stay, stay. Like this, so I know you're there. The conference room was on the 14th floor, and the windows faced west, and the afternoon light was coming in at an angle that made everything look slightly more significant than it might have otherwise. There were 6 of us at the table. My father, Gerald Morrow, my Aunt Patricia, my 2 cousins, the attorney, and me. We had gathered to settle the final details of my grandfather's estate. My grandfather, Edward Morrow, had died 8 weeks earlier at the age of 81. He had been a careful man, careful with money, careful with words, careful with the things he chose to keep and the things he chose to let go. He had built a modest fortune over 40 years in commercial real estate, and he had spent the last decade of his life making sure it would survive him in the right hands. I had believed, until that afternoon, that those hands included mine. The sentence had come after 40 minutes of procedural discussion. Executor duties, asset distribution, the house in Connecticut that nobody wanted to sell, but everybody wanted to use, the investment accounts, the charitable endowments my grandfather had cared about more than anyone had fully realized until he was gone. It had been going smoothly, the way things go smoothly when everyone in the room has prepared themselves for a version of events that turns out not to be the version that arrives. Then Arthur had reached the section about the primary residence, my grandfather's house, the one I had grown up in on weekends and summers, the one where I had learned to cook in the kitchen with him on Saturday mornings and had done homework at the long table in the study, and had slept in the same room every visit for 37 years. The room with the window that faced the garden. The room he had always called Rachel's room. Arthur read the line about the house. My father's name was not in it. Mine was. Gerald Morrow said, "That's a mistake." Arthur said, "It is not." My father said, "My father would not have..." Arthur said, "He did." The table was quiet for a moment. Then my father looked at me and said it. "You were never really family." Not in anger, not in grief, in the flat, declarative tone of a man stating a fact he had been sitting on for a very long time and had decided, in this moment, was his best remaining move. I stood up. I have already told you what happened next. What I have not yet told you is what was in the file. I need to stop here. What I'm about to tell you is true. I've adjusted 2 names and compressed a few weeks of timeline because some of this is still in legal process, and because some of the people in this story are still alive and still my family in ways that are complicated and not fully resolved. I sometimes use AI to help me hold the shape of something I have lived in fragments, but I'm only now telling all at once. None of that changes the conference room. None of it changes the file on the table, or my father's face when Arthur opened it, or what the documents inside it said about the first hours of my life. If you have ever sat in a room where the person who was supposed to protect you used your vulnerability as a weapon instead, stay with me. The file does not lie. It just waits until the room is ready. My father had always been a man of logistics. That was how I had understood him my entire life. Not warm, but functional. Not expressive, but present. He showed up to the things he was supposed to show up to. He paid for the things he was supposed to pay for. He performed fatherhood the way a competent contractor performs a renovation. Correctly, on schedule, without particular investment in how the finished product felt to the person living in it. I had spent 37 years telling myself this was enough. I had spent 37 years noticing, in the sideways way you notice things you have decided not to look at directly, the small asymmetries that did not quite add up. The way my grandfather looked at me differently than my father did. Not more lovingly. My grandfather was not a demonstrably warm man either. But differently. With a quality of attention that I had always attributed to the fact that I was his only granddaughter, or that we shared a love of early mornings and strong coffee, or that I had simply spent more time with him than my cousins had. I had never attributed it to the truth. The truth was in the file. Arthur had explained it before he opened it. He said my grandfather had come to him 14 months before his death. He had brought documents he had been keeping in a private safe for 36 years. He had asked Arthur to hold them and to open them at the reading of the estate, specifically in my father's presence, specifically in mine. He had said, "Gerald has known since the beginning. Rachel does not know. I have spent 36 years deciding whether to tell her. I have decided that I cannot tell her myself, but I cannot leave the world without making sure she knows." Arthur opened the file. The first document was a hospital record, Millbrook General, June 3rd, 1987. My date of birth. 2 babies had been born at Millbrook General on the night of June 3rd, 1987. Both girls, both healthy, both to families named in the record with the particular clerical precision of a hospital intake form that does not know it is creating evidence. One baby went home with the Harrington family. One baby went home with the Morrows. The record showed this clearly. What the record also showed, in a note added 3 days later, flagged with the hospital administrator's initials and a notation that a formal review had been initiated, was that the 2 infants had been placed in the wrong bassinets following a nursing shift change, and that the error had been identified. The families had been contacted. Both families had been informed. Both families had been given the opportunity to correct the situation. The Harringtons had requested an immediate exchange. The Morrows had declined. The note said, "Father, Gerald Morrow, was informed directly. Father stated family wished to keep the child currently in their care. Father signed the acknowledgement of notification. Arthur placed the signed acknowledgement on the table. My father's signature. June 6th, 1987. I was 3 days old. The room was very quiet. My Aunt Patricia had both hands over her mouth. My cousins were not looking at anyone. My father was looking at the acknowledgement. Arthur said, "Your grandfather received a copy of this document from the hospital administrator at the time. He was not the one who made the decision, but he kept the record." He reached back into the file. He said, "He also kept this." He placed a letter on the table. My grandfather's handwriting. The careful, slightly formal script I had seen on birthday cards and holiday notes my entire life. Arthur read it. My grandfather had written it 2 years before he died. He wrote that he had watched his son make a decision in 1987 that he had never been able to understand and had never been able to forgive, even as he had continued to love both of them, his son and the girl his son had chosen to keep. He wrote that the reason Gerald had kept me was not love. It was calculation. The Harrington family was working class. The Morrow family had money, a name, a future. Gerald had looked at 2 babies and made a business decision. He wrote, "Rachel was raised as a Morrow because Gerald decided a Morrow-raised child was more useful to him than a biological one. He was afraid that returning her and reclaiming his own daughter would mean raising a child who had bonded elsewhere, who would be harder, who would cost more. He chose convenience over truth and called it love for 37 years. He wrote, "I do not know if Rachel's biological family has looked for her. I do not know if they are still alive. I know only that she deserves to know, and that I am a coward for waiting this long, and that if I cannot say it to her face, at least I can say it where it cannot be unsaid." He wrote at the end, "She was always really family. She was just never told which one." My father said, "This is not." Arthur said, "Gerald." My father stopped. Arthur said, "The acknowledgement has your signature. The letter is in your father's handwriting. I had both authenticated before this meeting." My father looked at me. I looked back. I had been looking at his face my entire life, trying to find myself in it. I understood now why I never had. I said the only thing I had to say. I said, "How long did you know Grandpa had that file?" My father said nothing, which was answer enough. There are moments when silence is not ambiguity, when it is simply confession, wearing a quieter face. What came after was not fast, and it was not clean. DNA testing, legal consultations, conversations I had rehearsed in my head for weeks before I was able to have them in real life. A therapist, a lot of Thursday sessions. My husband sitting across from me at our kitchen table on a Sunday morning, while I held a coffee mug I was not drinking from and said out loud, for the first time, that I did not know who I was. He said, "You're the same person you were on Friday." I said, "I'm not, though." He said, "You're Rachel. That part hasn't changed." He was right. And he was also not entirely right, because Rachel was a name that had been chosen for me for reasons I had not known. And the weight of that, not the name itself, but the decision behind it, the signature on the acknowledgement form, the calculation my father had made when I was 3 days old, had changed something in the architecture of how I stood inside my own life. It took 4 months to find the Harrington family. They were not difficult to find. They had not moved far. Sandra and Paul Harrington lived 40 minutes from the town where I had grown up, in a house they had bought in 1991, with a daughter named Claire, who was 37 years old and who had known since she was 19 that she had been switched at birth, and whose parents had spent 18 years searching, in the quiet, persistent way of people who do not have the resources to make noise, but never stop looking. I called Sandra Harrington on a Tuesday evening. She answered on the second ring. I said, "My name is Rachel Morrow. I think we need to talk." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know your name." She said it the way you say the name of someone you have been looking for. I will not try to describe what it is like to meet the woman who should have been your mother. I do not have the language for it, and I am not sure language is the right tool anyway. What I can tell you is that Sandra Harrington held my hand across a restaurant table for a long time without saying anything, and that her daughter Claire sat beside her with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for something to be resolved for so long that the resolution itself feels unreal. And that Paul Harrington said, very quietly, after an hour, "We never stopped." 3 words. We never stopped. I thought about my grandfather's letter. I do not know if Rachel's biological family has looked for her. They had. They had just not known where to look. My father did not attend my grandfather's funeral repast. He sent a card. It said he was sorry for the choices he had made and that he hoped I would find peace. I read it twice. Then I put it in a drawer. Not because I could not forgive him. I am still working on forgiveness, which is a longer project than any single decision can complete. But because the card was for him, not for me. It was the apology of a man who wanted to feel like he had apologized, not the apology of a man who had understood what he had taken. There is a difference. Claire Harrington and I have dinner once a month. We are not close yet in the way that people who grew up together are close. We are close in the way that people who have been handed the same complicated truth are close, carefully, with a lot of patience, with the understanding that what we are building has no template and will have to be made from scratch. My grandfather's house in Connecticut is mine now. I go on weekends sometimes. I sit in the kitchen on Saturday mornings and drink coffee in the silence of a house that still smells like him. And I think about what he knew, and when he knew it, and why it took him so long. And I think about the difference between the cowardice he admitted to in that letter and the courage it took to write it. He was not a perfect man. He was a man who got one important thing right, eventually, in the only way he could manage. That is more than some people get. The room with the window that faces the garden is still called Rachel's room. I have not changed the name. Here is what I know now that I did not know before. Family is not the people who chose you first. It is not even the people who should have chosen you. Family is built in the choosing that happens after you already know the cost. The choosing that says, "I see what this is, and I am staying anyway." My grandfather saw what my father had done. He stayed. He watched. He kept the record. And when he could no longer stay, he made sure the record would speak. That is its own kind of love. Imperfect, late, insufficient in some ways, and real in others. The Harringtons looked for me for 18 years without knowing my name. That is also love. Unbroken, unrecognized, continuing anyway. And my husband, who sat across from me on a Sunday morning and said, "You are still Rachel." He knew something the rest of us were still learning. That who you are is not determined by the decisions other people made about you before you were old enough to be consulted. It is determined by what you do with what you find when you finally open the file. My father said I was never really family. He was wrong. I was always really family. I was just never told the full story of which family that was. Now I know. And knowing, even the painful, complicated, still unfinished knowing is better than the version of my life where I walked out of that conference room and never heard what Arthur Vance had been keeping safe for 14 months. I almost left. I am glad I sat back down. Thank you for staying with me through this one. The lesson I carry from all of it is not dramatic. It is this. The people who keep records of your worth when you cannot keep them yourself are the people who love you most clearly. And the people who use your uncertainty against you are the people most afraid of what you would become if you ever found out the truth. You are allowed to find out the truth. You are allowed to sit back down when someone tells you to, even when every part of you wants to leave, because sometimes the thing that saves you is the thing you almost walked away from. Subscribe if you want to stay with stories like this. Leave a comment, not about what you would have done, but about who in your life has kept a record of your worth when you couldn't keep it yourself. I'll be reading. And if there is a file somewhere with your name on it, a truth someone has been holding until the room was ready, I hope you find it. I hope you sit back down.